She didn't scream. She didn't resist. She didn't do anything wrong. But in the crowded first-class cabin of a flight, a black female passenger was still asked to leave her seat simply because someone said they didn't feel safe. Imagine this. You've bought a ticket legally. You're sitting in your seat. And then in front of hundreds of strangers, you have to make a choice. Should you stand up and let things go smoothly, or should you sit still and accept the risks to preserve your own dignity? If it were you, what would you do? What makes this story more than just an airport incident is that the woman wasn't a vulnerable person. She was a CEO. And a single calm phone call from her father, also a black CEO, caused the entire flight to be canceled. But the bigger question is, what would happen if she didn't have that power? And how many of us have ever stood up silently, walked away just to make others feel more comfortable? Stay. Because this isn't just the story of a flight. This is a story about dignity, choice, and the price of silence. If you've ever found yourself in moments like these, please, like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us on this journey. There was no shouting, no chaos. Just a heavy silence that made the air in first class feel thick and heavy. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was stationary at Gate B-32 Terminal 4, John F. Kennedy International Airport. The cabin lights had dimmed. The overhead compartments were closed. A dry click echoed from the aircraft door, the familiar sound, signaling the flight was about to depart New York for San Francisco. The passengers were seated. Some were adjusting their blankets. Others had their headphones on, closed their eyes, and were preparing for a 6-hour flight across America. And then, a voice rang out. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of this seat. Right now." A man's voice. Deep, not high-pitched, but chillingly decisive. Naomi Carter slowly lifted her head. She was sitting in seat 2, A first class. In front of her was a glass of mineral water not yet touched to the lips. On her lap was a worn-out brown, leather-bound notebook, the notebook she had carried with her since the early days of her career. Naomi saw that the person standing in front of her was an airport police officer, a dark blue uniform. A gleaming name tag, Officer Daniel Reeves. Behind him, several passengers began to take notice. One phone was raised, then a second. The pale blue light from the screen reflected off the polished cabin wall. Naomi didn't ask immediately. She had learned early on that in moments like these, the first reaction was more important than any explanation. She set the notebook aside. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests of the chair. Her voice was so calm it was almost devoid of emotion. "What's the matter, officer?" Officer Reeves didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Naomi from her neatly tied-up hair, her simple gray sweater, to her unassuming black leather shoes. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. But Naomi was all too familiar with it. "There's a complaint from a passenger," he said. "We need to verify some information. You need to leave this seat." Naomi frowned slightly. Verify what? Reeves didn't answer directly. He leaned slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough for those around him to hear. "She doesn't belong in this compartment." The air felt like it had been sucked dry. In the seat opposite, a middle-aged man paused to adjust his watch. Behind him, a young woman covered her mouth with her hand. Naomi could clearly feel every gaze directed at her, not loud but cold and sharp. She took a slow breath. "I have a valid ticket," Naomi said. "Seat 2A. I boarded the plane properly." Officer Reeves shook his head slightly, as if he were all too familiar with hearing this answer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice harsher, "I don't want to make things complicated, but you need to get up, right now." Another phone was held up. Someone started recording a video horizontally. Naomi looked directly at Reeves. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trembling. Only a very familiar feeling was rising within her, a feeling she had carried with her for 38 years of her life. The feeling of being asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" Naomi slowly took her boarding pass from her handbag. She held it out in no hurry. "You can check," she said. "I haven't violated any regulations." Reeves looked at the card. The scanner in his hand emitted a dry beep. The blue screen displayed the words, "Valid. First class." 1 second passed. 2 seconds. Then Reeves looked up. "You still need to come with me," he said. "This is no longer an option." A wave of whispers spread throughout the cabin. Naomi felt her heart pounding faster, not from fear, but because a very old question was echoing in her head. If I stand up, am I protecting myself, or am I contributing to what has always happened? She looked out the window. The New York sky was a pale gray, an ordinary morning. There was no warning that this would be the moment that would cause this entire flight to never take off. Naomi lifted her head again. "No," she said, her voice still very soft. "I won't leave my seat." Silence descended upon the aircraft cabin so deep and heavy that you could hear the engines idling on the runway. And somewhere deep inside, Naomi knew, this is just the beginning. Naomi Carter has been accustomed to moments like these for longer than anyone would think. It wasn't the moment she was asked to leave her first-class seat by the police. It was the moment the room suddenly fell silent as she walked in. The moment other people's eyes glanced over her a beat slower as if their brains needed more time to adjust to some assumption that had just been shattered. Naomi is 38 years old. She's not young, nor is she someone who's easily swayed. But each time the feeling still comes. A lingering, very real feeling. She was born south of Chicago in a neighborhood where people learned to distinguish the smells of rain, garbage, and anxiety from a very young age. Her father, Samuel Carter, was a hired aircraft maintenance mechanic. Her mother worked the night shift at a public hospital. They weren't so poor they went hungry, but poor enough for Naomi to understand that one wrong step could lead to a downfall. Samuel Carter always said the same thing to his daughter in a low, slow voice. "You don't need to be better than everyone else, but you must be prepared to be doubted more than they are." Naomi was only 12 years old at the time. She didn't fully understand, but she remembered it very clearly. In the years that followed, life taught her this in very concrete ways. The first instance was when Naomi received a full scholarship to a private high school. On enrollment day, a parent mistook her for the child of a school server, handed her a coat, and said, "Could you carry this inside for me?" Naomi carried it. Not because she didn't dare to argue back, but because at that time she wasn't strong enough to choose her own battle. The second time was at Stanford University. Naomi graduated with honors in systems engineering. During her thesis defense, a professor asked her a question he had never asked any white student. "Are you sure you can do this part yourself?" Naomi looked him straight in the eye and responded with a 15-minute presentation without looking at notes or stammering. After that day, she was never asked that question again, but she didn't forget it either. And then came the early years of entrepreneurship. Naomi's first company was just a group of 4 people working in a rented garage. They built supply chain optimization software for small transportation companies. Naomi was the CEO. But when meeting with clients, her eyes would always dart past her, searching for a man standing behind her to ask who's in charge. Naomi learned how to smile, and she replied, "I'm here." No raising your voice. No lengthy explanations. Just enough to force others to readjust their worldview. 10 years later, that company had become Carter Logistics Systems, a logistics technology conglomerate with contracts spanning across North America. Naomi no longer had to drive to meet each client herself. She had a legal team. She had an executive board. She had numbers that would make others bow their heads in admiration. But the look of suspicion never completely disappeared. Naomi understood this better than anyone when she stepped into spaces that were not meant for her in the way society implicitly defined them. First class on a commercial flight is one such example. She didn't choose first class because she liked the attention. On the contrary, she preferred quiet. But her work schedule required her to get enough sleep and be alert for long meetings immediately after landing. And most importantly, she learned a very personal lesson. If you always step back to avoid trouble, the world will take for granted that you don't belong. Naomi doesn't dress to impress. She opts for comfort. A charcoal gray sweater, dark trousers, a simple steel watch, no flashy jewelry. She once tried wearing expensive suits, high heels, and perfectly straightened hair, and she realized that it didn't change as much as people thought. The look of suspicion didn't come from the clothes. It came from a deeper belief. Therefore, Naomi chose to be herself. Back in first class, when Officer Daniel Reeves stood before her, all those memories flashed by quickly, not like a film, but like old scratches, painful with just a light touch. Naomi wasn't afraid of Reeves. She wasn't afraid of being removed from the plane either. What made her hesitate was a familiar question, one that had haunted her throughout her life. If I give in this time, what lesson will I be teaching to those who are watching? She glanced around. In the front seat, a white man in his 50s was pretending not to hear, but his hand gripped the armrest tightly. Behind him, a young woman was biting her lip, her eyes showing clear signs of confusion. and somewhere Naomi heard a very faint whisper. "What's wrong? Did she do something wrong?" No one stood up. No one voiced any protest. Naomi didn't blame them. She understood that feeling all too well. She turned to look at Reeves. "He checked my ticket," she said. "It's valid. I didn't cause any trouble. I didn't break any rules." Reeves let out a short sigh. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his eyes, the certainty of someone accustomed to others obeying. "Ma'am," he said, "we're just trying to keep the flight safe." Naomi nodded slightly. "Me too." Two simple statements, but between them lies a vast chasm. Naomi could feel her heart beating steadily, slowly. She wasn't trembling, but her palms were slightly cold, a very old reflex. She recalled the previous evening when she called her father. Samuel Carter still maintained the habit of answering the phone after 10 o'clock at night. His voice was deep, warm, and familiar. "Are you tired?" he asked. A little, Naomi replied. "But it's all right." Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he spoke very softly. "You don't have to shoulder everything alone." Naomi smiled. "I know." But now in the airplane cabin that phrase echoed in her head in a different way. She doesn't need to shoulder everything alone, but she also doesn't want to run away. Naomi sat up straighter, not to challenge anyone, but to remind herself where she stood. "I won't be leaving my seat," she repeated slowly. "If you need further verification, you can do it here." Officer Reeves looked at her longer than before, and somewhere in the airplane cabin someone pressed the record button again. Naomi knew that from this moment on things wouldn't be so simple anymore. She also knew she wouldn't be the one to avoid it anymore. If someone were to ask Naomi Carter if there was anything special about that day, she would probably shake her head. It wasn't a big contract signing day. It wasn't a blockbuster deal announcement day. Just another workday following another. The morning in New York began with a light drizzle, not heavy enough to be bothersome, but enough to make the air damp and cool. Naomi woke up at 5:30 as usual. No alarm clock needed. Her body had been accustomed to that rhythm for years. She brewed a cup of black coffee unsweetened. She sat by the window of her apartment looking down at the avenue that was beginning to fill with traffic. This city never truly sleeps, but there's a brief moment in the morning when everything seems to slow down. Naomi loved that moment. She checked her schedule. 3 meetings in San Francisco. A dinner with the investment board. Nothing too new, but enough to warrant a quiet flight. Naomi didn't carry much luggage, a small suitcase, a handbag, and the brown, leather-bound notebook she'd carried with her for over 10 years. The notebook was no longer smooth. The corners were worn. Some of the pages inside had faded, but it was where Naomi wrote down thoughts not meant for any meetings. She arrived at JFK almost an hour before her flight, not because she was worried about missing it, but because she didn't like rushing. Rushing easily leads to mistakes, and Naomi had paid too high a price for such mistakes in the past. Terminal 4 was moderately crowded. Long lines of people dragged their suitcases. Flight announcements blared steadily, mingling with the sound of wheels rolling on the stone floor. Naomi went through security with her priority pass. No problems. No one asked any further questions. Everything had been perfectly normal until then. In the first-class waiting area, Naomi chose a seat near the window. She didn't open her laptop. She just sat still, watching the people go by. Some looked very tense. Some looked tired. Some exuded a carefully cultivated air of confidence. Naomi had been in all those situations, and then she realized that the only thing that kept her grounded was her ability to not let other people's opinions determine her worth. When it was time to board, Naomi stood up and lined up in order. A flight attendant smiled politely as she scanned her card. There were no suspicious glances, no unnecessary questions. She entered the cabin with a completely blank mind. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 wasn't overly ostentatious. The seats were spacious. The lighting was soft. There was a faint scent of new leather. Naomi found seat 2, set down her bag and sat down. She fastened her seatbelt, placed her notebook on the fold-out table, then leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. It was a rare moment when she allowed herself to relax. Around her, passengers settled into their seats one by one. A middle-aged man in seat 1C was talking on the phone, his voice low but urgent. An elderly couple in the row behind them whispered about their travel itinerary. No one paid attention to Naomi, and that made her feel comfortable. Until Evelyn Whitmore appeared. Evelyn Whitmore was in her late 60s. Her blonde hair was neatly blow-dried. She wore a light-colored coat. An expensive handbag sat neatly in her hand. She paused in the aisle, looking around the first-class cabin as if inspecting something. Evelyn's gaze stopped at Naomi. Not long, but enough. Naomi could sense it even without opening her eyes. She had learned to recognize those gazes, gazes that measured, judged, and excluded. Evelyn frowned slightly. She looked at the seat number. Then she looked at Naomi again. A hint of displeasure flickered across her face. Very quickly, but it was undeniable. Naomi opened her eyes. Their gazes met. Naomi nodded slightly out of polite habit. Evelyn didn't respond. She turned away, pulling her suitcase toward her seat, but the annoyance lingered. Naomi heard a distinct sigh, like an unspoken complaint. She was used to it. But what Naomi wasn't used to was how the air in the cabin began to change so slowly, so subtly. Evelyn sat down. She pressed the call button almost immediately. Jessica Lane, the flight attendant in charge of first class, approached with a professional smile. "What's wrong, ma'am?" Jessica asked. Evelyn leaned forward and lowered her voice. But in the confined space of the cabin, her voice still reached the ears of those sitting nearby. "I think there's been a seating mix-up," Evelyn said. "These seats aren't usually reserved for people like that." Jessica paused for a very short moment. Her gaze swept over Naomi, then back to Evelyn. She didn't say anything immediately, but Naomi saw the hesitation in her eyes. It's a very human hesitation, and very dangerous. Naomi let out a soft sigh, not out of anger, but because she realized she was standing at a familiar crossroads. She could remain silent. She could stand up and avoid trouble. Or she could stay. She recalled a meeting a few years ago when a major partner bluntly told her, "We're not sure the market is ready for a CEO like you." Naomi then asked again very softly, "Are you talking about the market or about yourself?" That question changed the course of the negotiations. And at that moment inside the airplane cabin, Naomi understood that the ordinariness of this morning was gradually slipping into something else. Jessica turned around and smiled at Evelyn. "Madam, I will check again right away." She turned to Naomi. "Could you please show me your boarding pass?" Naomi held out her card without saying a word. The scanner beeped. "Valid." Jessica nodded. But she didn't leave immediately. "We just need to verify a little more," Jessica said, her voice still polite. "Please wait a moment." Naomi nodded. She looked out the window. Outside, a refueling vehicle was slowly driving past the aircraft. Ground staff in reflective vests were moving rhythmically. Everything was very orderly. A world that operates according to established procedures. Except for those glances that don't fit into any of those procedures. Naomi knew that from this moment on, this flight was no longer an ordinary flight, and she knew she would have to make a choice. It's not a matter of right and wrong, but of temporary security and lasting dignity. She placed her hand on the brown, leather-bound notebook. Her fingers gently touched the familiar worn areas. It was a small gesture, but enough to remind her who she was. Prejudice rarely manifests through shouting. It often comes very subtly, so subtly that if you don't pay attention, you'd think it's just politeness. But Naomi Carter lived long enough to know sometimes polite words are the sharpest things. Jessica Lane stood beside Naomi's chair longer than necessary. She smiled, but it wasn't the same genuine smile as before. It was more like a mask, worn out of habit, not out of belief. "Naomi," Jessica said, lowering her voice, "we just need to make sure everything is done correctly." Naomi nodded. "I understand," she replied. "Please check." Across the aisle, Evelyn Whitmore sat more upright. She pretended to look at her phone, but her eyes constantly darted toward Naomi, as if she were watching for something that didn't belong there. Naomi sensed that gaze very clearly. It wasn't intense, not overtly hostile, but there was a persistent unease, like someone who believed the natural order had just been disrupted. "Jessica Quay," sang Evelyn. "Ma'am, this passenger's ticket is valid," she said. "There are no errors." Evelyn lifted her head, her lips pressed together. A faint smile appeared. "Oh, I don't doubt the ticket," she said. "It's just, sometimes the system makes mistakes." Naomi turned to look at Evelyn. Her gaze was calm. No rebuttal. No defensiveness. But she didn't avoid the question either. "What misunderstanding are you referring to?" Naomi asked. Her voice was soft, but the question was clear. Evelyn shrugged slightly. "You know," she said, her voice still polite, "first class is usually reserved for people who know each other." A silence fell between the three of them. Jessica shifted slightly. She looked at Naomi, then at Evelyn. In her eyes was the awkwardness of someone caught between two worlds on one side, clear rules on the other, the invisible pressure from those accustomed to preferential treatment. Naomi felt a very old feeling welling up inside her, not anger, but weariness. Tired of having to explain things that don't need explaining. Tired of having to prove my presence is legitimate. You can be blunt, Naomi said, still very softly. You think I don't belong here. Evelyn chuckled softly. A short, unhappy laugh. You're being too sensitive, she replied. I was just saying, you don't look like the usual passengers who sit here. Naomi nodded. And what do those regular passengers look like, she asked. Evelyn opened her mouth, then stopped. She glanced around. Several passengers were starting to pay closer attention. Curious glances, phones held ready in their hands. We don't need to make a big deal out of this, Evelyn said, her voice starting to harden. I just want this flight to be safe. Naomi looked at Jessica. Is she saying I'm dangerous? Naomi asked. Jessica quickly shook her head. No, she said quickly. Nobody said that. But then she paused. A very small pause. Enough for Naomi to realize that the most terrifying thing wasn't the public accusation, but the hesitation. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. We all know what often happens on airplanes, she said, her voice lower. People who aren't used to this environment sometimes react uncontrollably. Naomi took a deep breath. What are you implying? She asked. Evelyn looked directly at Naomi for the first time without flinching. I was just saying, she replied, if there are any risks, I think the airline should address them promptly. No one said the word dangerous. No one said the word threatened. But everyone understood. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from the sad familiarity of the situation. She recalled a meeting many years ago when an investor told her he was not sure the shareholders would feel comfortable. No one said it outright because she was a black woman. But everyone understood. Naomi looked at Jessica. I want to make it clear, she said. I followed all the rules. I didn't bother anyone, and I have no intention of leaving my seat. Jessica swallowed. I understand, she said. But I need to report this to the shift supervisor. Evelyn smiled very slightly, a triumphant smile hidden beneath a layer of politeness. Naomi said nothing more. She watched Jessica leave, walking quickly toward the front of the compartment, where a partition and door led up to the cockpit. The airplane cabin was no longer as quiet as before. Whispers began to spread. A man in the back seat quietly said to his passenger, "What's going on?" Another woman frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Naomi sat still. Her back was straight. Her hands rested on the armrests. Inside, she was deep in thought. She can get up now. Go outside. Avoid whatever is forming. But then she thought about the years gone by. She thought about the times she had chosen to remain silent and let things pass. And she realized that each time the price she paid wasn't a seat, but a very small part of herself. Naomi lifted her head and looked straight ahead. She didn't know what Jessica would bring back. But she knew that from the moment Evelyn Whitmore said safe, the line had been crossed. This isn't about airline tickets anymore. It's not about seat mix-ups anymore. This is the age-old question society still asks people like Naomi. Are you allowed to be here? And this time Naomi made her decision. She wouldn't respond by leaving. Jessica Lane returned in less than 2 minutes. But for Naomi Carter, those 2 minutes were long enough to change everything about first class. The whispers were no longer discreet. A man in the back seat tilted his head slightly, saying something to his companion. Another woman glanced at Naomi, then quickly turned away as if afraid of being drawn into something she shouldn't be involved in. Someone had already lowered their phone, ready to record. Jessica stopped beside Naomi. Her professional smile had completely vanished. Instead, there was a very human tension, the kind of tension of someone trying to please everyone and about to fail. Naomi, Jessica said, her voice softer. The shift supervisor wants to see you at the front of the compartment. Naomi looked up. Why? She asked. It's just a private conversation, Jessica replied. We want to get this over with quickly. Naomi looked directly into Jessica's eyes. No reproach, no anger, but it was clear enough. I have nothing to say privately, Naomi said. If there's a problem, we can discuss it here. Jessica blinked. She glanced quickly at Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn sat still, arms crossed over her chest, her eyes betraying her impatience. I understand, Jessica continued. This is a request from the flight crew. Naomi nodded very slowly. Then let me make that clear, she replied. I will not leave my seat without a valid reason. A long silence followed. In the front, the cockpit bulkhead opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out. Mark Reynolds, the chief flight attendant. His face was middle-aged and tired, but his voice still maintained a commanding tone. Hello, Reynolds said, looking at Naomi. I'm the shift supervisor. There are some concerns from the passengers. Naomi didn't stand up. She looked straight ahead. What concerns? She asked. Reynolds cleared his throat. Regarding the appropriateness of the seating, he said, choosing his words very carefully. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Could you elaborate? Reynolds glanced at Evelyn. She immediately spoke up, unable to wait any longer. I told you so, Evelyn said, her voice louder than before. I don't feel safe. The airplane cabin was almost completely silent. Naomi Quay, sang Evelyn. Why? She asked. Evelyn shrugged. You know, she said, we all know there are people who aren't used to this environment. Naomi pursed her lips. She didn't interrupt. She let the statement hang in the air, raw, ambiguous, but venomous enough. Are you saying I don't know you? Naomi asked. Evelyn didn't answer directly. She turned to Reynolds. I think the airline should handle this sooner, she said, before something goes wrong. Reynolds turned back to Naomi. Miss Naomi, he said, his voice now firmer, to avoid disrupting the flight, we request that you temporarily leave your seat while we conduct further verification. Naomi felt her heart rate quicken slightly. Not from fear, but from the boundary. How long is temporarily? She asked. Reynolds did not respond immediately. We'll rearrange it, he said. Maybe a different seat. Where? Naomi asked. Reynolds avoided her gaze. It might be a different compartment. A few murmurs arose. Someone in the back whispered, What is this? Naomi took a deep breath. She looked at Reynolds. I bought a first-class ticket, she said, her voice still calm. I boarded the plane properly. My ticket is valid. There is no basis for asking me to leave my seat. Reynolds clenched his jaw. You're slowing down the flight, he said. We need to cooperate. Naomi didn't smile, but her eyes didn't waver. I'm cooperating, she replied. I just don't accept being treated differently because of someone else's subjective feelings. Evelyn let out a short laugh. That sounds good, she said. But this is the reality. Naomi turned to her. Yes, she said. That's the fact. And the fact is, I didn't do anything wrong. Reynolds exhaled heavily. Miss Naomi, he said, his voice growing impatient. If you don't follow the flight crew's instructions, we'll be forced to call security. The airplane cabin shook slightly. Not from the machinery, but from the threat that had just been uttered. Naomi felt her hands grow cold. It was an old reflex, but she didn't show it. Just call, she said slowly. I'll be here. Reynolds was taken aback. He hadn't expected Naomi to say that. Jessica stood beside them, her face pale. She looked at Naomi, then at Reynolds. Clearly, she didn't want things to escalate this far. Mark, Jessica whispered, Maybe we should. Reynolds raised his hand, interrupting. Miss Naomi, he said, this is my last request. Naomi looked around the cabin. Unfamiliar faces, avoidant glances, phones raised and lowered. She can get up, go outside. Let's end this. But then she thought of Samuel Carter. And the phrase he always repeated, You don't need to be better than everyone else, but you need to know where you stand. Naomi lifted her head. Her back was straight. Her voice was low and clear. I'm not leaving my seat, she said. If you need to go through the proper legal process. A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. Reynolds turned and strode quickly forward, where the cockpit bulkhead opened again. Naomi watched, knowing full well what would come next. This is no longer a dialogue. This is a confrontation. And Naomi just set the first boundary, a boundary the system doesn't like being reminded of. In the back seat, someone whispered so softly, almost inaudibly, She's really brave. Naomi didn't hear that. But she sensed something more important. She is no longer alone within herself. The first sound Naomi Carter heard wasn't footsteps. It was a heavy breathing sound. It wasn't hers. It was Mark Reynolds, the chief flight attendant, as he turned his back and strode quickly toward the front of the cabin. It was the kind of breath you'd get from someone forced to make a decision they didn't want to take responsibility for. Jessica Lane lingered beside Naomi for a few more seconds. She said nothing, just looked at Naomi, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Naomi, Jessica said softly, almost whispering. I really hope this doesn't go too far. Naomi looked at her. She saw no malice in Jessica, just a very human fear, fear of making a mistake, fear of losing her job, fear of standing on the unprotected side. Me too, Naomi replied. But there are some things that are unavoidable. Jessica nodded very slightly. Then she turned away. First class was no longer a private space. It resembled a small stage where every movement was being watched. The phones were no longer hidden. Some passengers placed their phones on the fold-out tables, pointing the lenses at Naomi. Naomi sensed it clearly, but she didn't bow her head. She stared straight ahead, at the cockpit bulkhead, at the door through which Mark Reynolds had just disappeared. And then, footsteps echoed, heavy, consistent, intentional. Officer Daniel Reeves appeared in the first-class aisle, confirming what Naomi already knew was coming. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't grumpy. But each step he took carried the certainty of someone accustomed to having others obey him. Reeves stopped next to Naomi's seat. Ma'am, he said, his voice low, we need to talk. Naomi turned to look at him. Her gaze didn't waver. We're talking, she replied. Reeves did not smile. I was informed that she refused to follow the flight crew's instructions, he said. That could constitute disruptive behavior. A wave of murmurs spread. Naomi took a slow breath. I'm not causing trouble, she said. I'm just not leaving the seat I bought. Reeves tilted his head slightly. Ma'am, he said, when the flight crew makes a request, you are obligated to comply. Naomi nodded. When the request is legal, she replied, and based on regulations, not feelings. Reeves looked at her longer. His gaze swept across Naomi's face, then settled on her hand resting on the armrest, calm, not trembling. There are safety complaints, Reeves said. We have to address them. Naomi looked over at Evelyn Whitmore. What was she complaining about? Naomi asked. Evelyn didn't answer Naomi. She turned to Reeves. I don't feel safe, she said. And I don't think I need to explain further. Reeves nodded as if that were enough. Naomi turned back to him. Feelings are not proof, she said. If there are specific allegations, I'm willing to listen. Reeves let out a short sigh. Ma'am, he said, I'm trying to help you avoid trouble. Naomi smiled faintly. Not a happy smile. Rather the smile of someone who had heard that phrase too many times. Me too, she replied. But avoiding trouble doesn't mean admitting you're wrong. Some passengers began to show their displeasure. One man whispered, Oh my God, what's going on? Another woman shook her head, clearly wanting the flight to depart immediately. Reeves lowered his voice. If you don't cooperate, he said, we will be forced to ask you to leave the plane. Naomi felt her heart beat a little faster. Not out of fear, but because a boundary had been crossed. For what reason, she asked. Reeves looked directly at her. Disrupting public order, he said. Not following instructions. Naomi nodded very slowly. Then make it clear, she said, that I was asked to leave the plane because I refused to give up my rightful seat. Reeves paused for a moment, very slightly, but Naomi noticed. Ma'am, he said, his voice harsher, this is the last time I ask you to stand up. The first-class cabin was silent. Naomi looked around again. Unfamiliar faces. Some avoided eye contact. Some looked curious, and very few dared to look directly at her. She can get up. Let's end this. Let's take another flight. But then Naomi thought of those who didn't have that choice. She thought of the times she had remained silent to keep things peaceful, and she realized that such peace always came at the cost of one's own dignity. Naomi placed both feet firmly on the floor. Her back was straight. I'm not getting up, she said. If you want to force me, you can. Reeves clenched his jaw. He turned his head, signaling to someone behind him. Another security officer appeared at the end of the compartment, standing to block the aisle. One passenger exclaimed, Unbelievable. Evelyn Whitmore breathed a sigh of relief as if everything was finally going according to her plan. Reeves went back to Naomi. You're putting yourself in a very bad position, he said. You have one last chance. Naomi looked him straight in the eyes. No, she said. I'm putting myself in an honest position. Reeves said nothing more. He took a step forward. The distance between them narrowed. Ma'am, he said, I order you to stand up immediately. Naomi didn't move. That moment lasted less than 2 seconds. But for Naomi it felt like a lifetime. She knew what would come next. And she knew that once this line was crossed, things would never go back to how they were. Somewhere in the background, a phone vibrated. a notification that the live stream had begun. And in the first-class cabin of the Boeing 787, the rules are about to be enforced, not by paper but by force. There are moments when time doesn't flow in the usual way. It doesn't flow, it stands still. And Naomi Carter is in one such moment. Officer Daniel Reeves stood in front of her, close enough for Naomi to see the fine wrinkles around his eyes, a sign of someone accustomed to pressure and power. Behind Reeves, another security officer stood blocking the passageway. First class now resembled a sealed room where every escape route was locked by gaze. Naomi didn't move. It wasn't because she was frozen. It was because she was considering something. In her mind, a silent dialogue was taking place. Not with Reeves, not with Evelyn Whitmore, but with herself. She can get up. Go with them. We'll sort this out somewhere else. Many people would do that, and Naomi understands. Because sometimes protecting yourself means a tactical retreat. But Naomi also understood something else, something not everyone is ready to face. Every time I step up to avoid trouble, the world will acknowledge that they were right to doubt me. She recalled the first time she learned this lesson when she was just 17 years old. It was late one evening in Chicago. Naomi was walking home after her overtime shift. A police car was driving slowly behind her. The lights weren't on, but Naomi knew. She always knew. "Hey," a voice called out from the car window. "Where are you going?" Naomi responded. Politely, clearly. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer still asked her to stand against the wall. Just for a quick check, Naomi complied. No arguing, no resistance. When she got home, her mother noticed a faint red mark on her wrist. "Are you all right?" she asked. Naomi nodded. But something inside her had subtly changed. She realized that collaboration doesn't always lead to respect. Now, more than 20 years later, Naomi faces the same choice again, only the context has changed. She's no longer the 17-year-old girl on the dark street. She's the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But the skeptical look remains the same. Naomi looked at Reeves. She didn't hate him, nor did she see him as an enemy. In her eyes, Reeves was just one part of a system accustomed to reacting in a stereotypical way. "Ma'am," Reeves repeated, his voice lower, "I don't want to hurt you." Naomi heard that, and she believed him in her own way. "I know," she replied. "But I don't want to hurt myself either." Reeves frowned. He didn't understand. Naomi looked down at her hands. Long, slender fingers that had typed millions of emails, that had signed contracts that changed the lives of thousands. Those hands weren't made for fighting. They were made for building. And that's why Naomi knew her strength didn't lie in her muscles. It lies in perseverance. She remembered Samuel Carter. She remembered the evenings he sat in the garage, the smell of engine oil clinging to his clothes, his deep, steady voice explaining seemingly trivial things to her. You know, he once said, people often think power is about making others afraid. But no. True power is about making others stop and ask themselves, am I doing something wrong? Naomi didn't fully understand then, but now she does. She lifted her head. Her eyes met Reeves'. No challenge, no pleading, just a very clear presence. "I'm not getting up," she repeated for the third time. "And I want you to know why." Reeves said nothing, but he didn't turn away. "It's not because I want to cause trouble," Naomi continued. "It's not because I think I'm better than anyone else." She paused for a moment, just long enough for her words to carry weight. "Because if I stand up just because someone feels uncomfortable seeing me here, then tomorrow someone else will be asked to stand up too. And the day after that." The first-class cabin was eerily silent. A man in the back seat let out a soft sigh. Another woman put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wavering. Reeves swallowed. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not here to argue." Naomi nodded. "I know," she replied. "You're here to enforce it." She took a deep breath, a long, slow exhale. She felt the air enter her lungs, then leave. Her heartbeat returned to normal. Is she scared? Yes, to some extent. Only those who have nothing left to lose are not afraid. Does she regret it? No. Naomi was thinking of younger people. People who would watch this video. People who would see a black woman being asked to leave her rightful seat or not. She had no illusions that she could change the world in a single moment. But she knew that every moment left its mark. Naomi glanced at Evelyn Whitmore. She was sitting very still, but her hand was gripping her handbag so tightly that the veins in her hand were bulging. Naomi wasn't angry with her. She just felt sad. Sad because fear is disguised as self-interest. Sad because one person's comfort is built on the exclusion of another. Reeves took a step forward. The distance between them was now less than an arm's length. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "is this your final decision?" Naomi looked him straight in the eyes. "Yes," she replied. "It's the final decision. There is no turning back." Inside the airplane cabin, a phone vibrated again. The word "live" appeared in small red letters on the screen. Naomi knew that the next moment would no longer belong to her alone, but she also knew one thing for sure: no matter what happens, she will not bow her head. Not out of pride, but out of self-respect. The moment Officer Daniel Reeves took another step forward, Naomi Carter knew that all the words spoken had come to an end. It's not because they're wrong. It's because they're no longer being listened to. Reeves raised his hand, palm facing down, a familiar gesture, signaling his colleague behind him to hold his position. The security officer at the end of the compartment stepped forward half a step, enough to block the aisle. The first-class compartment suddenly felt cramped, not because of its size, but because of the pressure. "Ma'am," Reeves said, his voice low, "and even by my authority, I order you to leave your seat." Naomi looked straight at him. "Are you arresting me?" she asked. Reeves paused for a very short while. This question forced him to choose his words more carefully. "Not yet," he replied. "But if you continue to disobey, it could happen." A wave of whispers swept through the compartment. One man blurted out, unable to restrain himself, "This has gone too far." Another woman shook her head, clearly bewildered. Naomi nodded slowly. "Therefore, I would like to note," she said, "that I was not informed of any specific violations." Reeves exhaled. "Ma'am," he said, "this is an aviation safety issue." Naomi looked over at Evelyn Whitmore. "Can you specify what the danger is?" Naomi asked. Evelyn tightened her grip on the bag strap. She avoided Naomi's gaze and turned to Reeves. "I don't feel safe," she replied. "That's enough." Reeves nodded as if that were the answer he needed. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from the arbitrariness. When one person's feelings are elevated to a legitimate reason for coercing another, feelings can't replace evidence, Naomi said, her voice still low. "If you need my cooperation, give me proof." Reeves didn't answer. He leaned in, lowering his voice, just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm giving you one last chance to stand on your own 2 feet." Naomi looked down at the armrest of the chair. Her hand rested perfectly still, not trembling, not clenched. She looked up. "I'm not getting up," she said. "Not this way." Reeves clenched his jaw. He turned his head and spoke quickly to the security guard behind him. A short word, a nod. Then, everything happened very quickly. Reeves placed his hand on Naomi's arm. Not roughly, but firm enough to convey a clear message. The moment skin touched skin, Naomi felt an instinctive reflex surge, a bodily memory from times long, long ago. "Please don't touch me," Naomi said, her voice steady. "I'm not resisting." Reeves didn't let go. "Get up," he said. Naomi didn't stand. Reeves increased the force. No pulling, no tugging, but enough to turn a request into coercion. A reaction erupted in the first-class cabin. "Hey, stop! She didn't do anything wrong! Leave her alone!" A man stood up abruptly in the back seat. The security officer immediately gestured for him to sit down. Naomi took a deep breath. She felt her heart rate quicken, then slow down. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She just spoke very clearly. "I didn't resist." Reeves and the security staff worked together. One held her arms, the other her shoulders. They lifted Naomi from the chair. Not violent, but she was left with no choice. When Naomi stood up, the first-class cabin fell silent. She appeared taller when standing. Her shoulders were straight. Her gaze was unwavering. She glanced around, unfamiliar faces, phones held aloft, flashing red live lights. Naomi knew that from this moment on, the story had moved beyond the airplane cabin. Reeves gestured for them to move. They led Naomi down the narrow passageway. Each step seemed to drag on. Naomi could clearly hear the sound of shoes hitting the floor, someone's heavy breathing and muffled whispers. A child asked very softly, just loud enough to be heard in the silence, "Mom, why did they do that?" No one answered. Naomi felt her throat tighten for a brief moment. She swallowed. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't in pain, but because she refused to let this moment define her. As they approached the hatch, Naomi turned her head and looked directly at Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn avoided eye contact. She looked down, adjusting her shawl as if she had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Naomi said nothing. She was led out of the first-class compartment. The doors opened. The air was colder. The light was harsher. New eyes awaited her. Naomi paused briefly at the doorway. Reeves tightened his grip. "Keep going," he said. Naomi walked away. And as she stepped through that door, she knew she was entering another phase of the story where power was no longer about words, but about files, records, and decisions made quickly and coldly. Behind them, the first-class cabin doors closed. A click sound echoed again. That sound was no longer a sign of preparation for takeoff. It's the sound of a line being cut. Naomi was led down the stairs. The wind was blowing. The smell of fuel was faint. The parking lot stretched out below. In the distance, engines hummed. She looked up at the pale gray New York sky. "It's all right," she told herself. "I'm still standing straight." A security officer spoke into the walkie-talkie. Short words. "Code. Procedure." "Reeves Quay," sang Naomi. "We'll settle this in security," he said. "You have the right to remain silent." Naomi looked at him. "I know," she replied, "and I will remember every moment here very clearly." Reeves did not respond. Somewhere online, the video has started to spread, and Naomi Carter, the woman who had just been escorted out of first class, knew that the real climax was yet to come. The airport security room has no windows. The fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling cast a cold white light, making all colors appear paler. Naomi Carter sat on a metal chair against the wall, her back straight, her hands resting on her thighs. Nothing here reminded her of the luxury of the first-class cabin she had just left. Only the smell of disinfectant old plastic and the unusually slow passage of time. Officer Daniel Reeves stood opposite. He removed his gloves and placed them on the table. The other security officer stood at the door, arms crossed. No one spoke for the first few seconds. Naomi could clearly hear her own breathing. Where is she? In JFK's security office. Why? Because she didn't stand up when asked. A part of her still couldn't believe things had gone this far. Not because she thought she'd been given preferential treatment, but because of the easy slip of her reason. Reeves broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dry, "I need to confirm your identity." Naomi nodded. "I'm ready," she replied. Reeves pulled out a small notebook. "Full name, Naomi Elise Carter." "Date of birth," Naomi replied. Clearly. Not too slow, not too fast. "Address of residence." Naomi read out the address of the Manhattan apartment. Reeves wrote it down. He didn't react in any particular way. Not yet. "Do you have any identification with you?" Reeves asked. Naomi reached for her handbag on the table, a very slow, deliberate movement. She didn't want any more misunderstandings. "In the bag," she said. Reeves opened his bag and took out his wallet. ID card, driver's license, company ID. He scanned each item, his eyes focused. Then his gaze stopped at a matte black card with a metal frame engraved with the name Naomi Carter. A very small beat. Reeves picked up the card and flipped it over. He said nothing. But Naomi saw his expression change, not much, just a little, as if some assumption had been shaken. "Where do you work?" Reeves asked. Naomi replied, her voice still calm. "Carter Logistics Systems." Reeves nodded, taking notes. He asked no further questions. He offered no comment. Then he stood up straight. "Ma'am," Reeves said, "because you did not follow the flight crew's instructions, we need to complete the enforcement procedure." Naomi looked at him. "What kind of coercion?" she asked. Reeves looked straight ahead. "Handcuffs," he said. During verification, a moment of silence fell. Naomi felt her heart tighten for a brief moment. Not from fear of something she had never seen before, but because of the significance of the handcuffs. They were more than just metal. They were a message being sent out into the world. She took a deep breath. "I'm not resisting," she said, "and I suggest you consider that." Reeves nodded. "I've noted that," he replied. He stepped forward and took the handcuffs from his belt. The sound of metal clanging together was dry and too loud in the enclosed room. The security guard standing at the door adjusted his posture as if preparing for something that might spiral out of control. Naomi held out her hand. "No jerking, no hesitation. Please don't squeeze too tightly," she said. Reeves paused for a moment. Then he did as he was told. The handcuffs closed around Naomi's wrists with a very small click, but that sound echoed in her head like a door slamming shut. The other arm was handcuffed next. Cold, stiff, painfully real. Naomi closed her eyes for a very brief second. She wasn't begging. She was just breathing. When she opened her eyes, she saw Reeves looking at her not as stern as before, but not softer either. "We need to move," he said. They led Naomi out of the security room. The hallway was long, brightly lit, and crowded. People stopped when they saw her. Some looked curious, some stared in astonishment, and many phones were raised. Naomi heard fragmented sentences. "What's going on? What is she doing? She doesn't look like a criminal." A middle-aged woman emerged from behind the coffee counter, frowning. "What did they do to her?" she asked loudly. The security guard raised his hand to signal. "Please move out of the way." Naomi walked between two men in uniform. She didn't bow her head, but she didn't try to appear stronger than necessary either. She just walked. In a corner of the hallway, a young man was holding his phone and live streaming. His eyes met Naomi's. She looked back. In that moment, Naomi didn't feel anger. She felt something else, responsibility. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice clear enough for the phone's microphone to pick up. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. "I'm being handcuffed for not leaving the chair I legally purchased." Reeves immediately leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, "you have the right to remain silent." Naomi looked at him. "I know," she replied, "but I also have the right to speak the truth." Reeves said nothing more. He gently squeezed Naomi's arm, gesturing for them to continue. They passed through a more crowded area. The noise increased. Some people protested loudly. One man said, "That's ridiculous." Another woman shook her head, her eyes red with tears. Naomi wasn't seeking that support, but she recognized it, and it made her throat tighten for a very brief moment. It wasn't because she was weak, it was because she realized she wasn't invisible. They took Naomi back to the security room. This time she was seated in a different chair with a fixed metal table attached. Reeves unlocked the handcuffs on one of her hands, then chained it to the metal ring on the table. "We'll contact our superiors," he said. "And the airline?" Naomi nodded. "Please do," she replied. The room fell silent again. Naomi looked down at her wrist. A red mark had begun to appear. She touched it lightly with her other hand. It stung. Does she regret it? That question came back to her. Naomi closed her eyes. She thought of Samuel Carter. She thought of the evenings he taught her how to refine every little detail, saying, "Don't let anyone decide who you are." She opened her eyes. Are not. She has no regrets. But she knew this was the lowest point. The point where the story could diverge in two directions, either sink or reverse course. Outside, somewhere in the airport, the Boeing 787 was still waiting. The passengers didn't know what was about to happen. They only knew that there was a passenger problem. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The fluorescent light was still cold. But inside her, something felt very firm. She knew she hadn't said the last word. Time passed in a very strange way in the security room. It doesn't flow smoothly. It's intermittent. Each time the metal door opened, Naomi Carter instinctively looked up. Each time it closed, the air seemed to thicken slightly. The fluorescent lights remained steady, unchanged, but the feeling inside her was different. She was no longer shocked. She was in a state of resignation. Officer Daniel Reeves stood outside the room, speaking to someone on the intercom. Naomi overheard fragmented words. "Passenger. Non-compliance. Airline is requesting a report." Those words sound familiar. Too familiar. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The handcuffs still held one of her hands to the metal ring on the table. Her other hand rested on her thigh. She kept her back straight, not to prove anything, but because bending down now would make her feel smaller. The door swung open. A man in a gray suit walked in. He was about 40 years old and wearing an airport employee badge. His face clearly showed his displeasure at being dragged into an unwanted situation. "I'm Richard Coleman," he said, "the shift manager for the company." Naomi nodded. "Hello, sir," she said. Richard looked at the handcuffs on Naomi's wrists, then at Reeves. "Did she resist?" Richard asked. "No," Reeves replied curtly. Richard turned back to Naomi. "Miss Naomi," he said, his voice just polite enough, "we're trying to resolve this as quickly as possible." Naomi looked at him. "What's the problem?" she asked. Richard took a deep breath. "There have been complaints from passengers," he said, "about disruptive behavior." Naomi smiled softly, silently. "Can you point out that behavior?" she asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. He opened a tablet and scrolled quickly. She refused to leave her seat when asked, he said. Naomi nodded. Yes, she replied, because I didn't break any rules. Richard looked at her longer. A scrutinizing look, but this time there was something hesitant about it. You understand, he said slowly, that in sensitive situations airlines must prioritize the safety of their passengers. Naomi lifted her head. Whose feelings are those? She asked. Richard paused. They belong to the other passengers, he replied. Naomi didn't ask any further questions. She was all too familiar with that answer. And what about my feelings? She asked after a pause. The feeling of being publicly handcuffed because of someone else's unnamed feelings. Richard looked down at the tablet. He didn't answer. Outside the room, the noise intensified. Naomi heard louder voices, hurried footsteps, and announcements blaring from a nearby loudspeaker. Another security guard poked his head in. The video is spreading very quickly, he whispered to Reeves. Someone recognizes her. Richard looked up. Recognize it, he asked. Yes, the other person replied. Someone said she's the CEO. Richard turned to Naomi. This time his gaze was completely different. Are you the CEO? He asked. Naomi nodded. Yes, she said. Carter Logistics Systems. Richard was silent for a few seconds. Then he turned to Reeves. Have you verified it? He asked. It's in progress, Reeves replied. Richard clenched his jaw. He turned back to Naomi. We'll need more time, he said. In the meantime, you'll stay here. Naomi nodded. Do I have any other options? She asked. Richard did not answer. The door closed again. Naomi closed her eyes. A very real feeling washed over her humiliation, not because of the handcuffs, but because of the way everyone avoided looking her in the eye. She thought of first class, of the eyes that had turned away as she was led outside, of the child who had asked her mother a question that no one answered. She wondered, if it wasn't her, would they dare to do that? Outside of security, the world doesn't stand still. A short video clip just over 30 seconds has begun to go viral. The camera is slightly shaky. The sound is unclear, but it's enough to show a black woman handcuffed, being led down the street in the airport. The title came up very quickly. The text didn't require much imagination. Passenger removed from first class. Security incident at JFK. Unruly traveler detained. Those words spread without context, without questions. But then, in the comments section, something else started to emerge. She didn't scream. She didn't resist. Why were she handcuffed? Another person wrote, I was on that flight. She just sat there. Small pieces of information. Disjointed. But enough to create a reverse flow. Naomi didn't know that. She only knew she was sitting in a cold room waiting. The door opened again. This time, it's Jessica Lane. She walked in very slowly. Her eyes were red and swollen. When she saw Naomi, she paused as if unsure what to say first. Naomi, Jessica whispered. Naomi looked at her. I'm fine, Naomi said first, her voice softening slightly. How about you? Jessica swallowed. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't. She didn't finish the sentence, but Naomi understood. Naomi shook her head very slightly. It's not your fault, she said. This system wasn't designed for someone like you, or me, to easily do the right thing. Jessica burst into tears. They're talking to their superiors, she said. And the flight hasn't taken off yet. Naomi opened her eyes a little wider. Not yet taken off? She asked. Jessica nodded. There are paperwork issues, she said. I don't know the details. Naomi nodded slowly. A very small, distant thought began to form in her mind, but she didn't touch it yet, not the time. Jessica stood up, preparing to leave. Naomi, she said, turning around. I just wanted you to know, not everyone believes what they're saying. Naomi looked at her. Thank you, she said. When the door closed, Naomi leaned back in her chair. She gazed up at the cold white ceiling. What did she lose? A flight, a meeting, a peaceful evening. And what did she manage to keep? Something far harder to measure. Dignity. Somewhere in an office far from the airport, a man is staring at his phone screen. He pauses on a video. He stares for a long time. His name was Samuel Carter, and he just recognized his daughter. Samuel Carter was not one to react hastily. He had been through too much in life to understand that reacting quickly doesn't necessarily mean acting correctly. But when the video paused at the moment Naomi Carter was handcuffed in the airport hallway, there was something very clear in his eyes. Not anger, not panic, but absolute focus. Samuel rose from his leather chair in his 32nd floor office. The room was large, quiet, and overlooked the Hudson River. On the walls were black and white photographs of old aircraft mementos of more than 40 years in the aviation industry. He didn't call his daughter right away. Samuel understood Naomi. If she could have called, she would have. If she hadn't, it meant she was handling the situation her own way. He put the phone down on the table. Dial a different number. Linda, he said as soon as the other end of the line picked up. Check something for me. The woman's voice on the other end of the line showed no surprise. Linda Perez, Samuel Carter's executive assistant, was familiar with that voice, a voice that only came through when something truly serious had happened. Yes, sir, Linda replied. What is the problem? There's a passenger being held up at JFK, Samuel said, his voice even. Her name is Naomi Carter, my daughter. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I need to know, Samuel continued, which flight, who is in charge, and why hasn't the plane taken off yet? Yes, Linda replied, her voice instantly changing. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Samuel hung up the phone. He turned back to his phone screen. The video was still playing. Comments were increasing every second. Some defended him, some were skeptical, some were simply curious. Samuel didn't care about them. He only cared about the process. Elsewhere in JFK Airport, the security room was still brightly lit. Naomi Carter sat still. The handcuffs had been removed from the table but were still on her wrists. Officer Daniel Reeves stood leaning against the wall, speaking to someone on the internal telephone. His voice was low and rapid. Richard Coleman walked in again. This time his expression was completely different. Gone was the initial annoyance. Instead, there was a wary look. Miss Naomi, Richard said, we need to verify a few more pieces of information. Naomi looked at him. About what, she asked. Richard cleared his throat. About your company, he said. Naomi nodded. I've provided the information, she replied. Is there anything unclear? Richard didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Reeves, then turned back to Naomi. Carter Logistics Systems, he said. Is it related to Carter Aviation Holdings? Naomi tilted her head slightly. Yes, she replied. It's my family's company. A moment of silence fell over the room. Reeves stopped talking. He turned and looked at Naomi. Family, he asked. Naomi nodded. My father is the chairman, she said. Samuel Carter. Reeves didn't react immediately, but Richard did. He blinked. Then he quickly opened the tablet. His fingers glided across the screen faster than before. One line of information appeared, then another. Richard looked up. Samuel Carter, he repeated. Carter Aviation Holdings. Naomi said nothing. She just looked at him calmly. Richard Quay sang Reeves. Do you know this company? He asked. Reeves frowned. That sounds familiar, he said. They lease planes. Very large ones. Richard swallowed. Not only are they big, he said softly, they own a portion of the charter fleet we're using. The room fell silent again. Naomi observed the two men before her. She saw no panic. Only a very slow shift in power as an old assumption began to crumble. Does that change anything? Naomi asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. He turned, walked out of the room, and made a phone call as he went. Reeves stopped. He looked at Naomi. This time his gaze was no longer as stern as before. But it hadn't softened completely either. Ma'am Reeves, said his voice lower, why didn't you say so sooner? Naomi looked at him. Because that shouldn't be necessary, she replied. My ticket is valid. Rules are rules. Reeves was silent. He looked down at the handcuffs. We'll reconsider, he said. Naomi nodded. I hope so, she replied. Outside, Linda Perez called Samuel Carter back. Sir, Linda said the flight is Flight 782 Boeing 787. The airline is holding the plane at the gate due to a passenger issue. The person directly responsible is the duty officer, Richard Coleman. Samuel listened, and he asked. There's another point, Linda said. That plane is on Carter Aviation Holdings' maintenance contract list. Samuel nodded slightly, though Linda couldn't see it. Thank you, he said. Connect me to the legal department. And schedule a call with the company. Yes. Samuel put down the phone. He stood still for a few seconds, looking out at the river. The water flowed steadily, oblivious to the turmoil of human activity. He wasn't angry. He was prepared. Back in the security room, Richard Coleman turned around. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Miss Naomi, he said, his voice much more cautious, we will adjust our approach. Naomi looked at him. Which way? She asked. Richard exhaled. For now, he said, we'll remove the handcuffs. And, sorry for the inconvenience. Naomi didn't react immediately. She looked at the handcuffs. Then she looked at Reeves. I want everything documented in writing, she said. And I want to know exactly what's changing. Richard nodded very quickly. Of course, he said. We'll take a record. Reeves unlocked the handcuffs. The metal slipped from Naomi's wrists. The feeling lessened, but the red marks remained. A mark that doesn't disappear so quickly. Naomi gently rubbed her wrist. She said nothing. Could you wait a little longer? Richard asked. We're receiving instructions from higher up. Naomi looked at him. I waited, she said, and I'm still waiting. Richard nodded. He left again. Naomi leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes for a very brief moment. Not to rest, but to memorize. She knew that from the moment her true identity was revealed, the story had taken a different turn. Quiet. No surface drama. But somewhere in the system, the gears have started to stall. Richard Coleman's phone on his desk rang. Not a rapid vibration. Not a continuous vibration. Just one short and clear vibration, the kind that's impossible to ignore. Richard looked at the screen. An internal number. No name displayed. But he knew exactly where these kinds of calls usually came from. He stood up immediately. Excuse me, Richard said to Naomi Carter, his voice completely different from before. No longer commanding. Only caution remained. Naomi nodded. She didn't ask. She was used to the idea that true power needed no explanation. Richard stepped out into the hallway, closing the security room door behind him. Reeves straightened up as he saw him take the call. Richard gestured for Reeves to wait. Richard Coleman, listen, he said. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then a deep, slow, and perfectly calm voice spoke. Richard, the man said. This is Samuel Carter. Richard swallowed. Despite his mental preparation, his throat still felt dry. Yes, Mr. Carter, Richard replied. I am Samuel, Carter interrupted. Not rudely, just decisively. I didn't call to hear an explanation, he said. I called to ask a very simple question. Richard remained silent. Is my daughter safe? Samuel asked. No superfluous words, no superfluous emotions. Richard replied immediately. She's safe, he said. We've removed the handcuffs. Thank you, Samuel replied. Now I'll ask you my second question. Richard straightened up as if this call were being recorded in his very conscience. Why hasn't the flight taken off yet? Samuel asked. Richard took a deep breath. There's a passenger incident, he said. We're handling it according to procedure. Samuel paused for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice unchanged. Did you know that Boeing 787 is under maintenance contract with Carter Aviation Holdings? Richard felt sweat soaking through his shirt very quickly. Yes, he replied. I was just informed, Good Samuel said. Then you know every decision regarding the operation of that aircraft must comply with the terms and conditions. Richard nodded, though the person on the other end of the line couldn't see him. Yes, sir, Samuel continued, his voice still low and steady. I'm not asking for special treatment, he said. I'm asking for process. Richard closed his eyes for a very brief moment. Mr. Carter, he said, we are reviewing the whole matter. Samuel didn't respond immediately. He let the silence last for another beat. Enough for Richard to understand that this wasn't a call for negotiation. When a passenger with a valid ticket is forcibly removed from their seat because of someone else's feeling, Samuel said, it's no longer an operational issue. It's a matter of accountability. Richard nodded repeatedly. We understand, he said, and we will take responsibility. Samuel paused. Then he spoke his final words, his voice no higher than before, but each word falling with a heavy weight. Until I receive a full report, he said, that flight will not take off. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Sir, he began. Samuel didn't let him finish speaking. Not because of me, he said. Because of right and wrong. The call has ended. Richard stood still in the hallway for a few seconds. The noise of the airport still echoed around him, announcements, footsteps, the clatter of suitcase wheels, but to him everything seemed to have gone silent. He went back to the security room. Naomi Carter sat still. Her hands rested on her thighs. Her back was straight. The red marks on her wrists were still there like an underline for everything that had happened. Richard walked in. This time he wasn't taller than Naomi. He pulled up a chair and sat down opposite her. "Miss Naomi," he said, his voice slow and low, "I just spoke with your father." Naomi looked at him. Her gaze was calm. "Yes," she said. Richard continued, "will be suspending the flight." Naomi didn't react immediately. "Why?" she asked. Richard swallowed. "Because we need to review the entire process of handling the incident," he said. "And because there are serious issues that need to be clarified." Naomi nodded. "That's the right thing to do," she said. Reeves stood in the doorway saying nothing. But his eyes had changed. The initial certainty was gone. Only thought remained. Richard continued. "You'll be taken to a private lounge," he said. "And we'll arrange another flight for you." Naomi looked at him. "I don't care where I go," she said. "I care about how this will be recorded." Richard nodded. "We'll take full account," he said. "And I apologize." The word sorry was spoken slowly, heavily, not smoothly. But Naomi knew it wasn't a personal apology. It was the first sign of acknowledgement. Naomi stood up. This time no one touched her. No one gave her orders. She stood tall, shoulders open, gaze steady. "When I sat down in that seat, Naomi said I wasn't asking for special privileges. I was just asking to be treated like a regular passenger." Richard nodded. "We failed to do that," he said. Naomi looked at him. Then she said, "Make sure that doesn't happen again to anyone." Richard bowed very slightly. A small gesture. But in this context, it carried great significance. Outside the security room, announcements blared over the loudspeaker. "Attention passengers of Flight 782. Due to operational reasons, boarding is temporarily delayed." The passengers in first class exchanged glances. Those who had witnessed Naomi being led away now heard the announcement with a very different feeling. Somewhere in the airport, someone whispered, "This isn't that simple." Naomi stepped out into the hallway. The light shone on her face. She took a deep breath. She didn't feel victorious, nor did she feel completely relieved. She only knew one thing: the calm voice had brought the entire system to a halt. And the real climax is yet to come. The Boeing 787 remained stationary at Gate B-32. The engines had already started emitting that familiar steady hum. The cabin lights were on in flight mode. The crew was in position. Everything technically was ready for takeoff. But the plane didn't move. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Harris glanced at his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. He was a veteran pilot with over 20 years of long-haul flight experience. He had encountered all sorts of delays, weather, technical issues, disruptive passengers, but this situation was different. "Tower, this is Flight 782, Harris said into the radio. "We are ready to leave the gate. Confirm the reason for holding the aircraft." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then the coordinator's voice came through, slow and cautious. "Flight 782, hold your position," the voice replied. "Director's orders." Harris frowned. He turned to the co-pilot. "Operation," he repeated. "Not engineering." The co-pilot shook his head. "I don't know, Captain." In first class, the anxiety spread very quickly. A middle-aged man stood up, opened and closed his overhead compartment, as if the action could make time pass faster. Another woman pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "What's going on?" she asked. "We're late." Jessica Lane walked in, her professional smile carefully adjusted. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this flight is experiencing a short operational delay." "What operation?" the man asked sharply. Jessica didn't give a specific answer. She bowed her head slightly. "We will provide an update as soon as possible." In seat 1C, a passenger whispered to the person next to him, "Is this related to the woman we just saw?" The other person didn't answer, but their eyes said it all. Rumors spread faster than any official announcement. In the airline's control room at JFK, the atmosphere was tense. Richard Coleman stood in the middle of the room, a phone pressed to his ear. On the large screen in front of him was a flight schedule with Flight 782 flashing yellow. "We can't keep the plane indefinitely," a senior manager said. "There are over 200 passengers on board." Richard nodded. "I understand," he said. "But this is no longer just our decision." "What do you mean?" the other person asked. Richard lowered his voice. "It's related to Carter Aviation Holdings," he said. "They have the right to cease operations under the terms of the agreement." A heavy silence fell over the room. "Are you talking about Samuel Carter?" someone asked. Richard nodded. "Yes." On the other side of the airport, Naomi Carter was escorted to a private lounge. Not a luxurious one. Just a quiet room with gray, fabric-covered chairs, a small table, and a glass door overlooking the runway. She stood by the window, gazing at the stationary Boeing 787. From this angle, the plane looked enormous, very stable. A massive block of metal just waiting for a signal to take off. Naomi didn't feel any sense of satisfaction. She just felt heavy. She thought of the passengers sitting there, people who didn't know what was happening, people who just wanted to go home. She didn't want them to become secondary victims of a necessary decision. The waiting room door opened. Richard Coleman walked in, accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man in a black suit, wearing a high-level security badge. This was Thomas Keller, the company's regional operations director. Miss Naomi Keller said, his voice polite but serious, "I am Thomas Keller." Naomi returned. "Hello, sir," she said. Keller looked directly at her. "We want to have a frank conversation," he said. "This has gone beyond a single incident." Naomi nodded. "Yes," she replied. "It's been over since I was handcuffed." Keller didn't shy away. "We've reviewed the preliminary report," he said. "And there are serious errors." Richard stood beside them silently. "The plane is being held," Keller continued, "not to exert pressure but to ensure we don't miss anything." Naomi looked at him. "What, for example?" she asked. Keller exhaled. "The way complaints are handled," he said. "The way power is used. And the way we allow a vague feeling to become the basis for action." Naomi listened, without interrupting. "We'll have to explain ourselves," Keller continued. "To the board, to the regulators, and to the public." Naomi nodded very slightly. "That's the right thing to do," she said. Out there on social media, the story has taken a distinct turn. It's no longer just a disruptive passenger. It's no longer just a security incident. A new title has appeared: Flight delayed after passenger detained. CEO detained at JFK, questions raised. Why was she removed? There were more questions than answers. Inside the aircraft, Captain Harris received a call from the air traffic controller. "Flight 782, a voice said. "We are holding the aircraft under high-level orders." "How long?" Harris asked. "There is no specific time yet." Harris switched off the radio. He turned around and looked out the cockpit window where the pale gray sky stretched out before him. "This is a big deal," he said to the co-pilot. In the waiting room, Naomi received a text message. From Linda Perez. "Your father is on his way to handle it. He wants you to know, stay put. Everything will be done properly." Naomi read the message. She didn't reply immediately. She put her phone away. She didn't want to rely on her father's power. But she also didn't deny the fact that power was being used to force the system to comply with its own rules. Keller stood up. "Miss Naomi," he said, "we will make an official announcement to the passengers." Naomi looked at him. "And what did he say?" she asked. Keller looked straight ahead. "The truth is," he replied, "that the flight was delayed due to an error in handling passengers. And we are rectifying it." Naomi nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Not for me, but for everyone else." Keller bowed very slightly. A small gesture, but one that carried significant meaning. Through the window, Naomi saw a mobile staircase approaching the plane. Not for passenger boarding or disembarking, but for technicians to review operational records. The entire airport started buzzing with excitement. Staff members whispered. Flight attendants exchanged glances. Security personnel moved around more than usual. Someone was speaking very softly somewhere. This trip, something big must be going to happen. Naomi stood still, watching the plane that didn't take off. She didn't feel like she was winning. She only knew one thing. When true power emerges, it doesn't shout. It makes everything stop. And at JFK, an entire Boeing 787 is standing still to remind everyone of that. The airline's temporary meeting room at JFK was located upstairs, away from the noise of the boarding area. It wasn't spacious. It wasn't luxurious. A rectangular table, a few chairs, and a wall-mounted screen displaying the airline's logo in standby mode. Naomi Carter walked in with Richard Coleman and Thomas Keller. She wasn't asked to sign any papers. Her phone wasn't confiscated. The handcuffs were gone. But the red marks on her wrists were still there, a small, quiet detail, but one no one in the room could ignore. The door to the room closed. Officer Daniel Reeves, Mark Reynolds, and Jessica Lane were already in the room. Evelyn Whitmore sat at the end of the table, her hands on her handbag, her gaze averted. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. Thomas Keller stood up first. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "We're going to talk straight. No beating around the bush." He looked at each person in turn, then stopped at Naomi. "Miss," Naomi Keller said, "we want you to hear the entire process before drawing any conclusions." Naomi nodded. "I'm here to listen," she replied. "And to speak." Keller Quay sang, "Richard, you begin," he said. Richard Coleman cleared his throat. He opened his tablet and scrolled through his notes. About 15 minutes before takeoff, Richard said we received a complaint from passenger Evelyn Whitmore about feeling unsafe. Evelyn looked up when she heard her name. She opened her mouth, but Keller raised her hand. "Let him finish speaking," Keller said. Richard continued. "Flight attendant Jessica Lane checked the ticket. The ticket was valid," he said. "However, due to safety concerns and to avoid flight disruption, the crew decided to ask passenger Naomi Carter to leave her seat for further verification." Naomi listened. She didn't interrupt. Keller Quay sang Mark Reynolds. "You," Keller asked. Mark Reynolds exhaled. "We tried to resolve the situation quickly," he said. "But when the passengers refused to cooperate, we called security." Keller nodded. Then he turned to Reeves. "Officer Reeves." Reeves stood upright. "I was notified of the non-compliance," he said, "and there was a safety complaint. I acted within my authority." Keller looked around the table. Then he turned back to Naomi. "Naomi," he said, "that's the summary." Naomi was silent for a few seconds. Not because she needed time to understand, but because she was choosing her words. "I have a question," Naomi said, finally her voice even. Keller nodded. "Please." Naomi looked directly at Evelyn Whitmore. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you said you didn't feel safe. I want to ask you something very specific." Evelyn shifted in her chair. "What makes you feel unsafe?" Naomi asked. Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. She glanced at Keller, then Richard, then Reeves. No one spoke up to help. "Can you specify?" Naomi continued. "An action, a word, or a particular sign from me?" Evelyn swallowed. I just have a feeling," she said. "You don't look like..." She stopped. "Not like what?" Naomi asked, her voice still calm. Evelyn blushed. "He's not like the other passengers who usually sit there," she said softly. A silence fell over the meeting table. Not an awkward silence, but the silence of a truth that had just been revealed. Naomi Quay sang Keller. "You heard it," she said. "No action, no words. Just, it didn't look like it." Keller didn't shy away. "Yes," he said. "I heard." Naomi Quay sang Reeves. "Officer Reeves," she asked, "what questions did you ask me before you touched me?" Reeves remained silent. "Did you ask me if I did anything wrong?" Naomi continued. "Or were you simply told that someone didn't feel safe?" Reeves exhaled. "I was notified about the complaint," he said. Naomi nodded. "So do you have any other evidence besides that complaint?" she asked. Reeves did not respond. Naomi Quay sang Mark Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "on what basis did you ask me to leave my seat?" Mark bowed his head. "I relied on an assessment of the situation," he said. Naomi nodded again. "What are the criteria for evaluation?" she asked. Mark said nothing. Naomi turned to Jessica Lane. Her voice softened slightly. "Jessica," Naomi said, "you checked my ticket. It's valid." "Right." Jessica nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "it's perfectly valid." Naomi looked around the table. "So she said I was asked to leave my seat, escorted off the plane handcuffed, all because of an undefined feeling." No one objected. Naomi placed both hands on the table. The red marks on her wrists were clearly visible under the light. "I'm not here to demand compensation," she said. "I'm here to ask a question that many others have probably wanted to ask." She looked directly at Keller. "If I weren't me," Naomi said, "if I didn't have the last name Carter, would this end here?" The room was completely silent. Keller looked at Naomi for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "No," he said. "Probably not." Naomi nodded. "That's the problem," she said. "Don't raise your voice. Don't get angry. It's just a fact laid out on the table." Keller stood up. "We will take full account," he said, "and we will take responsibility." Naomi looked at him. "Responsibility isn't just about the report," she said. "It's about the next steps." Keller nodded. "We understand." Naomi turned to Evelyn Whitmore. There was no resentment in her eyes. I hope Naomi said the next time she doesn't feel safe, she'll ask herself why. Evelyn bowed her head. She said nothing. The meeting ended without applause. There were no loud promises. Only their eyes have changed. Naomi stepped out of the room. The hallway was brighter. The air was lighter. She knew that justice rarely comes through eloquent speeches. It comes through simple questions that no one dares to answer. And today, such a question has been raised. News doesn't explode. It spreads. Not through sensational headlines at the outset, but through slow, repeated questions across various platforms. Why was a passenger with a valid ticket handcuffed? What does feeling unsafe mean? What procedure allows that to happen? The next morning when Naomi Carter woke up in her Manhattan apartment, her phone had over 30 missed calls. Not all were from the press. There were familiar numbers, partners, colleagues, old friends, and there were strange numbers from people she'd never met but who saw themselves in the story. Naomi sat up very slowly. There were still faint marks on her wrists. It didn't hurt much, but it was enough to remind her that yesterday wasn't a dream. She opened the curtains. Morning light streamed in. The city was functioning as usual. Cars, horns, hurried people. There was no sign that yesterday's airport incident was creating any undercurrents. But Naomi knew the most important waves are often not immediately visible. She turned on the TV. A morning news channel was discussing an incident at JFK. The footage didn't show the handcuffs. Just the moment Naomi sat still in first class, her eyes calm before things escalated. The presenter spoke slowly and carefully. The issue isn't that the flight was delayed, he said. The issue is what criteria are used to assess a threat. A legal expert sitting nearby nodded. Feelings are not proof, she said, and if the system allows feelings to become the basis for action, then anyone could be the next victim. Naomi turned off the television. She didn't want to hear any more. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she knew the story had slipped out of her hands. At Carter Logistics Systems headquarters, the executive board held an emergency meeting, not to address a brand crisis, but to reach a very clear agreement. We are not making a defensive statement, one member said. We are speaking the truth, and only the truth. Naomi sat at the head of the table. She listened more than she spoke. Naomi, a colleague, turned to her. Would you like to give a speech? Naomi thought for a few seconds. Not now, she said. Let the story speak for itself. Meanwhile, at JFK, consequences were no longer an abstract concept. Mark Reynolds has been temporarily suspended pending an internal investigation. No fuss, no press release. Just a short email sent at 6 in the morning asking him to step out of his post. Jessica Lane was called to the Human Resources Department. Not to be reprimanded, but to give her statement. She walked into the room with slightly trembling hands, but when she came out, her eyes were different. I've said everything, she told a colleague. For the first time, I haven't been silent. Officer Daniel Reeves was asked to submit a supplemental report. He sat in his small office rereading every line he had written. The words now looked completely different, no longer a process but a choice. He recalled the moment he placed his hand on Naomi's arm. Not roughly, but it wasn't necessary. Reeves crossed out a line. Rewrote it. Slower. Elsewhere, Evelyn Whitmore closed the doors of her suburban home, drawing the curtains tighter than usual. Her phone rang incessantly. Friends asked. Acquaintances asked. A relative whispered. Perhaps this time she should apologize. Evelyn didn't answer. She sat down in her chair, staring into space. For the first time, an unpleasant question arose in her mind. What if that person were my child? At the same time, other stories began to appear on social media. A black woman wrote, I was once asked to change seats because I was not suitable. I stood up. A man of Latin American descent wrote, I was once asked for my ID on a domestic flight. I remained silent. The stories are different, but the feeling is the same. Naomi reads them in the evening. She doesn't reply to each one. She just posts a short message on her personal page. I can hear you. No hashtags, no slogans, just 4 words. At Carter Aviation Holdings, Samuel Carter met with the legal department, not to immediately file a lawsuit. Rather, to review the terms, responsibilities, and most importantly, standards. We don't use power to punish, he said. We use it to force the system to correct itself. A lawyer nodded. We have proposed an independent review, he said, with a third party. Samuel nodded. Go ahead, he said, and announce the results. At the airline, Thomas Keller sent an internal memo. From today, the memo reads, all decisions relating to passenger security must be based on specific, clearly defined conduct. No exceptions. The record doesn't mention Naomi Carter by name, but everyone understands why it exists. In the evening, Naomi sat alone on the balcony. The city lights came on. She held a glass of water but didn't drink. She just watched. She thought about the question that had brought down yesterday's meeting. A simple question. Not everyone dared to ask it, and not every system was willing to listen. Are you tired? Yes. Did she think it was worth it? She didn't know. But she did know one other thing. If this simply stopped at a CEO being treated differently, it would be meaningless. Meaning only comes when those without a prominent identity also benefit from the change. Naomi's phone vibrated. A message from Jessica Lane. Thank you, for yesterday and for today. Naomi smiled very slightly. She replied, thank you, for telling the truth. At JFK, Flight 782 finally took off hours late. There was no public apology. No lengthy announcements. Just a flight leaving the ground carrying a story that had managed to stay. Naomi stood up and went inside. She closed the balcony door. She didn't know how far these changes would go, but she knew they had begun. And sometimes starting is all that's needed. Manhattan at night isn't as noisy as people think, at least from the high floor where Naomi Carter stood looking down at the Hudson River sparkling with lights. The city below was still moving, but here in this quiet apartment everything slowed down enough for one to hear their own breath. Naomi placed the phone down on the table. The screen turned off. No new notifications. No more messages. For the first time in days, she allowed herself not to react. She sat down on the sofa, her back relaxed. Her hands rested on her thighs. The marks on her wrists had faded, leaving only a very faint shadow. But the memory hadn't. Did she do it correctly? The question came too late. Not in the security room, not in a hearing, but here when all eyes had gone away. Naomi recalled every moment. Officer Daniel Reeves' gaze as he placed his hand on her arm. Mark Reynolds' silence. Jessica Lane's tears. And Evelyn Whitmore's hesitant words not the same. The pieces are disparate, but when put together they form a very familiar picture. She stood up and walked toward the bookshelf. Business books were neatly arranged. Hardcovers, bold titles. But Naomi didn't reach for them. She pulled out a thin, worn-spine notebook, the one she'd carried with her throughout her early entrepreneurial years. She turned the page. The familiar words appeared, the ink faded. Don't let anyone define you unless you allow it. Samuel Carter wrote that sentence for her long before the Carter name appeared on major contracts. Naomi sat down at the table. She didn't write right away. She just looked at the blank page, letting her thoughts drift without holding on to them. Are you scared? Yes. It's not fear of power. It's the exhaustion that comes from always having to stand tall. Would you like things to end faster? Perhaps. But ending quickly often means omitting what needs to be said. The phone vibrated softly. Naomi looked at it. A message from Samuel Carter. Are you okay? Just 3 words, no advice, no instructions. Naomi smiled. She answered, I'm fine. I'm learning how to rest. A period at the end of a sentence. Very small. But for Naomi, it meant a lot. Elsewhere in the city, Officer Daniel Reeves sat alone in his small kitchen. On the table lay the final report he had just submitted. He reread it line by line. Not to revise it, but to understand it. He thought of Naomi Carter, not as an object, but as a person so calm that it baffled him. What was I doing then? I didn't ask. Reeves put down his pen. He didn't know if this report would make any big difference, but he knew that next time he would ask. In the suburbs, Evelyn Whitmore stood before a mirror. She adjusted her gray hair. She gazed at herself longer than usual. She recalled Naomi's gaze in the meeting room. Not angry, not contemptuous, just a questioning look. Evelyn whispered softly as if talking to herself. What was I afraid of? There are no immediate answers. But the question is there, and it doesn't disappear. At JFK, Jessica Lane finished her shift late. She changed out of her uniform and stepped outside. A cold wind blew. She pulled her coat closer. She recalled the moment she stood up and told the truth. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. But when she finished speaking, she felt relieved. What is that feeling? It's freedom, a small feeling, but a very real one. She sent another message to Naomi. It wasn't long. I've enrolled in a new internal training course. I want to do better. Naomi read the message while pouring water. She paused for a moment. Then she replied, I believe you. No further additions are needed. Naomi returned to the sofa. She sat down. This time, she allowed herself not to think about tomorrow, not to think about the newspaper headlines, not to think about the upcoming meetings. She thought back to a morning long ago when she was a young girl, standing in front of the mirror practicing saying a very simple sentence, I am here. She had said those words many times in her life, but never before had they resonated so strongly. Does she want to become an icon? No. Naomi never wanted to. She simply wanted a world where normalcy didn't need to be proven. Outside the window, a plane took off. Its lights flashed. The sound of the engines faded into the distance. Naomi watched until it was just a tiny dot of light. She knew that not every flight carried a story like hers. And that was a good thing, because ideally stories like this don't need to happen. Naomi got up and walked toward the bedroom. Before turning off the light, she turned back to look at the room one last time. The city was still there. The world was still going on. But somewhere in the smallest details, some people have changed the way they see things. And sometimes that's all it takes to start something new. A week after the incident at JFK, Naomi Carter returned to the airport. No press followed. No official announcement. Just an early morning flight, the soft yellow light reflecting off the polished stone floor. Naomi pulled her small suitcase, walking slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't avoiding anything. She was just walking like an ordinary passenger. The marks on her wrists were gone, but she still remembered the cold feeling of the handcuffs very clearly. Not to hurt, but to remember. When Naomi arrived at the security check area, she lined up. Ahead of her was an elderly couple. Behind her was a young man wearing headphones and holding a coffee cup. No one recognized her, and that made her feel relieved. When it was her turn, Naomi placed her items on the conveyor belt. Security personnel checked her documents. Their eyes briefly glanced over her without lingering. Please continue, the employee said. Naomi nodded. Thank you, she replied. That's all. There was no feeling of insecurity, no suspicious glances, no noticeable differences. Naomi walked through security, her heart skipping a beat. Not because she was sad, but because she realized how precious this simple thing was. In the boarding area, Naomi sat down in a seat near the window. Outside, the plane was being prepared. Ground staff moved about steadily. Everything looked familiar. She opened her phone. A new email from Thomas Keller. Miss Naomi, we have completed our independent review. The recommendations have been adopted and implemented. Thank you for forcing us to take a look at ourselves. No flowery language, no lengthy explanations. Naomi finished reading and put down her phone. She didn't reply immediately. She knew that not every thank you needed a response. A familiar voice rang out from behind. Naomi returned. Jessica Lane stood there, not wearing her flight attendant uniform, just jeans, a light jacket, and her hair neatly tied back. She looked younger and lighter. I'm going to school, Jessica said, smiling. A new training course. Internal. Naomi stood up. Congratulations, she said. Jessica hesitated for a moment. I just wanted to say, she continued, I've thought about it a lot. And I think if you had gotten up and gone with them that day, I probably would never have asked the question. Naomi looked at her. I asked the question, Naomi said. And that's what's important. Jessica nodded. Her eyes lit up. See you later, she said. Good luck, Naomi replied. Jessica left. Naomi returned to her seat. She watched the young woman disappear into the crowd. A feeling of profound peace spread through her chest. Perhaps Naomi thought this is how change is happening. Not through big moments, but through small, repeated choices. The boarding announcement sounded. Naomi stood up and joined the line. When she reached the boarding gate, the staff member scanned her ticket and smiled. Have a pleasant flight. Naomi returned the smile. Thank. She entered the cabin. This time not first class, just a window seat in the middle row. Naomi put down her luggage and sat down. She liked this spot. She could look out. She could think. As the plane began to taxi, Naomi looked out at the runway. She remembered the last time also at this airport when everything came to a standstill. Today, everything is in motion. And that is exactly how it should be. In Manhattan, Samuel Carter sat in his office reading the final report from his legal team. He folded it up and set it aside. He didn't call his daughter right away. He knew Naomi needed her own space. Samuel looked out the window. He thought about the question Naomi had asked in the meeting room, a question that wasn't offensive, not accusatory, just a request for honesty. He smiled very slightly. She's grown bigger than I ever imagined. In the suburbs, Evelyn Whitmore sat in her living room. On the table lay an unsent letter. She had written it, then torn it up, rewritten it, then stopped again. Finally, she folded the letter, not to send it immediately, but to remind herself that her own comfort could not be built on the insecurity of others. At a small police station, Officer Daniel Reeves attended a refresher training session. He sat in the back seat taking notes, not because he was required to, because he wanted to. When the instructor talked about behavioral assessment, Reeves nodded. Not because he understood everything, but because he was learning. Naomi's plane took off. The city loomed below. The buildings became mere blocks. The Hudson River meandered like a ribbon of silk. Naomi leaned her head back against the chair. She closed her eyes. This time not because she was tired, but because she felt peaceful. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if these changes would last. But she knew one thing for sure. When she sits still in that chair, it's not to challenge. When she stands firm against the system, it's not to win. To put it simply, I'm here, and I deserve it. That quote wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who had ever been told to shrink down, to be quiet, to leave so that others could feel more comfortable. The plane stabilized its altitude. The seatbelt sign went off. A flight attendant walked by and asked quietly, "Would you like water or coffee?" Naomi opened her eyes. She smiled. "Water, thank you." The flight attendant nodded and walked away. Naomi looked out the window again. The blue sky stretched out. The space was vast. There were no barriers. She thought about everything that had happened, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to take it with her. She left them there like a story that had already been told, not to forget, but to move on with life gently and honestly. And somewhere far away, another person might be sitting quietly in their chair when the time comes, not because they know Naomi Carter's name, but because they know their own worth. This story doesn't suggest that everyone needs to confront others, nor does it advocate using power to overpower them. The deeper message lies in something very simple. A person's worth should not depend on the subjective feelings of others. In life, especially as we get older, it becomes easier to choose peace and quiet. We learn to compromise. We learn to remain silent and let things pass. And sometimes, because of this, we get used to taking a step back, even when we haven't done anything wrong. Naomi Carter's character doesn't win through anger. She wins through calmness, clarity, and self-respect. She didn't ask, "Who am I that you dare do this to me?" She asked a much simpler question. If I weren't me, would things be different? That question isn't just for the system. It's for each and every one of us. Because in life, there are times when we don't need to raise our voices. We just need to avoid bowing our heads. And sometimes, simply staying put even when you're tired is enough to pave a better path for those who come after you. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of a moment in your life, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Every share you make can help someone else believe that they deserve it. We will meet again in stories that are very real, very true, and very human.